muchachos y muchachas. Just kidding, that's all I know. Today, we're looking at this 2007 Yukon. We're going to be replacing the front brake pads and rotors on this vehicle. But this will be the same, if not very similar, to other makes and models such as, well, GM makes and models, the Cadillac Escalade, the Chevy Avalanche, the Chevy Suburban, the Chevy Silverado, the Chevy Tahoe, the GMC Sierra, the GMC Yukon, and the GMC Yukon XL. I believe there's going to be some more on that I'm missing in this list. There will also be a list of the vehicles in the description below, as well as a lot of helpful links for parts and tools and such. So, front brake pads and rotors on this vehicle doesn't take long. We're going to do them in this video. I'm going to give you the tools, or I'm going to tell you the tools that we're using as we go. And on part 2, I believe, we're going to be reinstalling everything and we're going to be using the proper torque specifications to tighten everything up. You might be wondering, how do I get the proper torque specifications, or how do I know the proper torque specifications? Well, here, this is the motor book, brake specification guide. This is a very helpful book that I turn to in many occasions. If you check out my video library, I have a ton of brake job videos out there, and you always want to do the best BJ you can every time you do a BJ. So that includes lubrication, good tools and parts, and proper torque specifications, the best BJs out there. Now in this video, I'm going to answer hopefully all of the questions you might have and give you a lot of tips and tricks and tell you about everything else. So let's get going on this 2007 Yukon. Like, subscribe, and share while you're watching. If this video does help you out, make sure you comment below with the year, make, model of the vehicle that the video did help you on. Let's get going. You can see we have the vehicle jacked up with a jack stand under the vehicle and the wheel off. You'll notice that little circle thing in the center of the rotor on the hub. That is a centric ring. You might not have that on your vehicle, and you probably won't have that on your vehicle. That should have came off with the wheel, but this one stayed on, and I'm going to take it off later when I get the rotor off. I don't want to break it trying to remove it just on its own. So jacked up, jack stand. I'm going to turn the wheel to the passenger side so the caliper and the caliper assembly is easier to get to and just easier to access when you're sticking further out instead of having to go inside that wheel well. So everything turned to the passenger side. Of course, make sure you're properly jacked up and the vehicle is not going to move or fall when you turn that wheel. That's why I like using that jack stand and whatnot. Now that the wheel is turned to the passenger side, let's take a look at the brake assembly and look at everything that we are going to actually be removing. Make sure you have the proper tools to get everything off, so the proper sockets, see what size you're going to be using. Throughout this video, I'm going to show you the tools and the sizes of everything, sockets that we will be using to remove this caliper and caliper bracket. And your vehicle might be a little bit different depending on the year and make, but pretty much everything disassembly wise is going to be the same, other than you might have a couple different size bolts here and there. To remove this caliper and bracket, and pretty much for the whole brake job, you only have 4 bolts that need to be removed. These caliper bracket bolts and the actual caliper bolts themselves. So these are the 4 that we are going to be removing to get your pads and rotors off. Nothing else needs to be removed to get this job done. So I need to find a 1/2 inch breaker bar, a 19mm socket to remove the caliper off of the bracket, and then an 18mm socket is going to be what it takes to remove the caliper from the knuckle. You're really going to need a breaker bar on this vehicle because the torque specifications on this vehicle are really tight. Using the 19mm socket and the 1/2 inch breaker bar, I loosened up the caliper bolts. You might have a problem loosening these bolts up if your slider pins are not seized like this one happened to be. It was a little bit easier being that they are seized or were seized. So remove these caliper bolts using your 19mm socket. Like I said, get a crescent wrench on your slider if you need one. I used that 1/2 inch breaker bar to loosen them up and got them to where they were finger tight, and we just took them out or removed them using the fingers. Now you can see both bolts are out. Set them off to the side, somewhere you're not going to lose them and not going to ruin them somehow. Go ahead and remove the caliper itself, and we're going to press the pistons back into the caliper. You can see when I remove these brake pads, you saw all that dust coming off when I removed the caliper, but look at these brake pads. The inboard pad is completely destroyed. The brake should have been done quite a long time ago. but that's because the caliper itself was seized. It wasn't moving back and forth, which causes excessive wear on the brake pads. You might be wondering what flew off when I took those brake pads off. That was the actual old hardware kit, and when I buy brakes, I always make sure they come with a new hardware kit, so I don't really care about those old ones that flew off, and it makes it a little bit easier disassembling everything as well. Now we're going to go ahead and press the pistons back into the caliper. Before you push the pistons back into the caliper, you want to make sure your brake fluid reservoir has the cap loosened up, just in case when you're pressing the pistons back in, the fluid doesn't blow any seals anywhere and it has somewhere to escape. You might get brake fluid on the floor, but you would way rather have brake fluid leak out of the reservoir than blow a seal somewhere. Not that it's ever happened to me, but I heard of its possibility, so better safe than sorry. Now, using the old brake pads as the pressure plate to compress the caliper, I am going to push the pistons all the way back into the caliper as far as I can, which should be depressed all the way in. You shouldn't see any of a lip sticking out when it's already pressed in. I'm using this caliper compressor that I got. I mostly use it when I do like Mercedes and BMW, but it seems to work really good on a dual piston setup like this. It's one of my favorite brake caliper compression tools. I do have a bunch in my arsenal as well. This front brake job, this is the second one we've done in 140,000 miles. And if you were to take your vehicle to a shop and get this process done on your vehicle, you'd probably be paying somewhere around 350 to 400 bucks for this front axle, just on the front axle. That's not all four. And to do this at home in the garage, I think we paid about $300 for all front pads and rotors and the rear pads and rotors with hardware kits and good brakes. So you will save a lot of money doing this on your own at home after you watch this video. Let's get this piston, or both these pistons, pressed back all the way into the caliper. You can see it took a little bit of oomph. It wasn't the easiest thing. This is probably the hardest part of the job, actually, is getting the pistons pushed back into the caliper. But it didn't take too much. If you could pick up the wheel, you could probably do this, the wheel that you actually took off. So it's a little bit more agonizing, but it's really not the hardest thing in the world. And this brake job up front took me about an hour and a half to get done. You can see the pistons pressed all the way into the caliper. With the caliper compressed all the way, I'm using these little S hooks that I found online. They're really, really helpful. And I'm hooking the caliper up on the spring, so it's not just hanging there. You don't want the caliper to hang on the brake hose, because if you do, you might run into some problems. You might break that hose, you might do more damage and end up giving yourself a lot more work. You can see it's hooked right there under the spring with that S hook. These are super convenient. Up until like a month ago, I used to use a bungee cord to hold it up there, and they worked, but these little S hooks work way better. Look at that rotor, completely destroyed. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the caliper bracket from the spindle. These two 18mm bolts, get that 1/2-inch breaker bar again, loosen them up. That's really the only way you're going to get these loosened up. The torque specification on these are pretty darn tight. I think it was around 145 pounds. We'll go over that on the installation process, but you can see that 1/2-inch breaker bar, getting it out again. I think I had to even use, or if I didn't, you might need to use a cheater bar, so like use the end of your jack. If it'll fit over your breaker bar, that'll give you a little bit more oomph or a little bit more power to get this thing loosened up. But loosen these up, use that breaker bar to loosen them up, and then you could use either your fingers or a 1/2-inch socket wrench, ratcheting socket wrench, to get them out all the way. I would recommend not using a 1/2-inch socket wrench to loosen these up, because you might ruin the teeth or the gearing inside the head of your socket wrench if you do put a lot of pressure on that head. So always use a breaker bar to loosen up tight screws, or tight bolts like this, that is. Remove the caliper bracket bolts, just set them off to the side. Again, you don't want to lose them, don't want to make this job any harder than it already is. With both bolts out, go ahead and remove the bracket off of the knuckle. Now we're going to set this off to the side as well. We're going to clean this up, lube up the sliders and everything during the reinstallation process. Now we could just remove the rotor. This one was completely destroyed, which I love just looking at it. It's pretty crazy how bad it was. But with this rotor and that centric ring, I took a couple little whacks using my rubber mallet. This is actually a dead blow hammer, not a rubber mallet, and it came right off. Yours might be on there or like pretty much seized on there from rust and road grime and everything, so a few good whacks is what it might take to get the rotor off. Don't be afraid to hit it too hard, and you shouldn't do much damage to that hub assembly and the bearing itself. Now we have the brakes completely disassembled. We're going to get ready for the reinstallation process. You can see I'm already starting to clean up the hub surface right there, and we'll get back to all this in the reassembly on part 2. So make sure you like, subscribe, and share. Check out the video library for part 2. Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies, and I'll see you on the next hopefully helpful video.